Good morning, everyone. All protocols having been duly observed. Greetings to all of you gathered here today. It is with great pleasure that I welcome you to this inaugural signing of these two significant memorandum of understanding between competent agencies, supervisory authorities, and law enforcement agencies, all of whom play a key role in the implementation of Guyana's anti-money laundering, countering the financing of terrorism, and proliferation financing regime. The signing of the MoU on cooperation and information sharing between law enforcement agencies, namely the Financial Intelligence Unit, the Guyana Police Force, the Guyana Wildlife Conservation Management Commission, the Special Organized Crime Unit, Customs Anti-Narcotics Unit, the Guyana Defense Force Coast Guard, the Guyana Revenue Authority, Central Immigration and Passport Office, and the Office of the Director of Public Prosecution, and the signing of the MoU on cooperation and information between competent authorities, law enforcement agencies, and supervisory authorities, namely the Financial Intelligence Unit, the Special Organized Crime Unit, the Bank of Guyana, Guyana Gold Board, the Guyana Revenue Authority, the Guyana Securities Council, Guyana Geology and Mines Commission, Gaming Authority, Guyana Wildlife Conservation and Management Commission, the Chief Cooperative Development Officer, the Registrar of Friendly Societies, the Commercial and Deeds Registry, the Ministry of Home Affairs, the Attorney General's Chambers and Ministry of Legal Affairs, and the Office of the Director of Public Prosecutions. It's a part of Guyana's effort to implement and comply with Recommendation 2 of the Financial Action Task Force 49 recommendation, which deals with national cooperation and coordination and requires countries to ensure that policymakers, namely the FIU, law enforcement agencies, supervisors, and other relevant competent authorities at the policymaking level and operational levels have effective mechanisms in place which enables them to cooperate and, where appropriate, coordinate and exchange information domestically with each other concerning the development and implementation of policies and activities to combat money laundering, terrorist financing, and the financing of proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. Further, this should include cooperation and coordination between relevant authorities to ensure the compatibility of AML, CFT, and CPF requirements with data protection and privacy rules and other similar provisions. Recommendation 2 is assessed under immediate outcome 1, and the core issue to be considered in determining if this outcome is being achieved in relation to recommendation 2 considers to what extent do the competent authorities and supervisory bodies cooperate and coordinate the development and implementation of policies and activities to combat money laundering, terrorist financing, and proliferation financing, and where appropriate, the financing of proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. Furthermore, in assessing Guyana's effectiveness in the implementation of this recommendation, the assessors from the Caribbean Financial Action Task Force will look at what mechanisms or body do the authorities use to ensure proper and regular cooperation and coordination of the national AML-CFT-PF framework and development and implementation of policies to combat money laundering and terrorist financing at both policymaking and operational levels, and where relevant, the financing of proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. And does the mechanism or body include all relevant authorities? 2 is interagency information sharing undertaken in a timely manner on a bilateral or multi-agency basis as appropriate. And 3, are there adequate resources and expertise involved in conducting the assessment of risk and for domestic cooperation and coordination? As such, it is hoped that the execution of these two MoUs will facilitate cooperation between all relevant agencies who are parties to the MoUs, and that there will be timely information sharing on all matters relevant to AML, CFT, and PF. It is also hoped that each agency will work strategically to implement the provisions of the MoUs to ensure that Guyana's fight against organized crimes, criminal and terrorist network is one. It is also hoped that all the information shared at today's sensitization workshop will adequately guide each agency and ultimately Guyana as we swiftly move towards the CFATF's on-site visit to Guyana in September. Once again, welcome.
Thank you, Ms. Smith. I would now like to invite Mr. Romel St-Hill, who will give you some brief remarks and disseminate Guyana's national terrorism strategy, its national terrorism financing strategy, and its national proliferation financing strategy.
Hi, good morning everyone. All protocols being observed. Thank you very much for attending this very important meeting. My task here is quite brief, of course, because I know you're all busy persons. I just want to point you to the contents in your folder for the heads. The regular technocrats who interact with myself will have received them by email, so I'm sure they're quite familiar with them. So firstly, there is an executive summary of the National Risk Assessment, which was published in July 2021. As you know, we're being assessed by the Caribbean Financial Action Task Force, of which that assessment will commence next week, and the Honorable Attorney General will tell you more about that. But of course, this synopsis is, of course, to refresh your memories in terms of this National Risk Assessment. We have been working quite hard, and coming out of the National Risk Assessment, there was a national policy and strategy, and following on that, because of what is required in terms of the CFATF, we did a national counter-terrorism strategy, a national strategy for the combating of terrorist financing, as well as a national strategy to combat proliferation financing. So these are documents which push Guyana to the forefront of the fight against money laundering, terrorist financing, and proliferation financing. So these are just my brief remarks to point you to the documents within your folder. And at this point, I will bid my farewell, but thank you very much for attending this session.
Thanks, Romel. At this time, I would like to invite the Attorney General, Honorable Mr. Anil Nandalal, who will give you some remarks on the mutual evaluation that begins the on-site assessment that is in the next 2 weeks, beginning on September 4th. And he will give you some remarks on that assessment and how it will go.
Thank you very much. My colleague, the Honorable Robeson Ben, Minister of Home Affairs, the Director of Public Prosecutions, Ms. Shalimar Ali Haq, Mr. Romel St-Hill, the Commissioner of Police, the Governor of the Bank of Guyana, the other heads of agencies, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, permit me to thank you very much for attending this engagement, and permit me to thank you also for the hard work that you have done so far as part of Guyana's preparation for its intended, very important mutual evaluation assessment exercise, which will be conducted by the Caribbean Financial Action Task Force beginning on the 4th of September, that's next week, Monday, and ending approximately 2 weeks thereafter. Many of you are very familiar with this assessment, but as the press is here, permit me to speak a little broadly so that our country can understand the nature and purport of the exercise. We live in a radically different world now, and in a world where there are global regulators of important activities. Crime and security are foremost considerations on the global stage, and countries across planet Earth have had to prepare for issues relating to crime and security. International agencies have been established to assist countries in combating crime and in ensuring public safety across the globe. One of those agencies is the Financial Action Task Force, and that agency has established peripheral regulatory agencies across the globe to which it has deputed responsibilities. In our part of the world, the assigned agency is the Financial Action Task Force. The Caribbean Financial Action Task Force, abbreviated as CFATF. The important activities that the Financial Action Task Force seek to regulate are organized crimes generally, but more specifically, a focus on terrorism, money laundering, and of recently, proliferation of weapons of mass destruction and the financing of these horrendous international crimes. Trafficking in person is one that has been added recently. Though in the Caribbean, comparatively, one can say that we are fairly safe, having regard to the type of crimes to which I have just referred. Nevertheless, as part of the global framework, we have to be prepared and we have to submit ourselves to the international regulatory framework. In any event, all the empirical data suggests that the marauding criminal gangs of the world have assets, for want of a better word, located at every corner of the globe. So no area is really safe. So in the Caribbean, we have to comply with the supervision of the Caribbean Financial Action Task Force, and there is a process by which a peer review is done at periodic intervals by trained personnel of the CFATF, where they examine the financial and law enforcement framework and structure of individual member states at periodic intervals to determine whether each member state meets the prevailing requirement. This is a continuous, ongoing exercise that started some 2 decades ago and continues. And more it becomes more intensified, and as I just indicated, a larger number of offenses are brought under its purview and review. So we began with an anti-money laundering, countering the financing of terrorism act sometime in 2001, and then that was rendered outdated, and we did another comprehensive one to replace and repeal that one in 2010, and that has remained to date our substantive piece of legislation. But as is the nature of this endeavor, it requires review and amendments at periodic intervals to comply with the evolving and changing Tested. To meet the evolving and dynamic change or changes that afflict the global landscape when it comes to crime and criminality. You will know that crime and criminal conduct are not constant. They change, they evolve, they become more sophisticated. They use the advances that are made in the area of science and technology and information technology, etc., to conduct their affairs. So constantly we have recommendations that are churned out almost on an annual basis, which require all countries to keep updating their laws. In preparation for this exercise, we had to update our laws. And if you don't, then you are sanctioned regionally and internationally. And Guyana is not without scars in that regard. Many of you will recall during the period of 2011 to 2015, the joint opposition, using their one-seat majority, voted down a series of legislative changes which we were required internationally to effect to our AML-CFT legislative framework. And as a result, we were put on a grey list and we were visited with sanctions locally, regionally, and internationally. The banking sector is here and they will tell you that they lost correspondent banking relations. Those who are here representing the money transfer agencies will tell you that when persons turn up at Grace Kennedy in New York, they had to show source of income, they had to show their legitimacy in the US, etc. So there were a slew of sanctions that were imposed upon Guyana. We have not yet fully recovered from those sanctions. So we had to ensure that we bring our legislative requirements up to speed, and you may have observed over the last 2 or 3 months, we passed in our National Assembly a very comprehensive AML-CFT amendment bill. We also laid and passed some AML-CFT regulations to that substantive law. We passed a real estate agents and brokerage bill, and we passed a national compliance bill. Those bills taken together would have met our national requirements in terms of bringing our legislation up to where we are required to be. Administratively, we also had to do a number of things to ensure that we implement the relevant recommendations. Not all of them relate to legislation. Others include, for example, the execution of the Memoranda of Understanding, which we will execute later this morning. Another component had to deal with, for example, our membership to the Edmund Group, which we are about to accomplish. So we have been working over the past 2 years in preparing our country for this important assessment, and that's why I want to thank you for the work that you have done. But the last lap is also very, very important. We have been meeting with individual groups to ensure that we dot all the I's and we cross all the T's as we prepare for the on-site examination, which will begin on Monday. You will have received various documents in writing assisting you in your preparation. I just want to emphasize that when we begin our engagement with the assessors, let us remember that we are all one team, and we are Team Guyana. So there may be a tendency to protect one's agency, and in so doing you throw another agency under the bus. Let us avoid that. It's a chain, and once there is a weak link in the chain, the entire chain's integrity becomes questionable. So it makes no sense trying to say that this is not your fault, it's SOCU, because SOCU didn't do the charge, or SOCU didn't do the investigation. Let us assume that SOCU is wanting in that regard. That doesn't help you, because Guyana is being judged. The entire structure is being judged. And we are not going to be graded by the performance of individual agencies. We are going to be graded as a whole, because we are one integrated AML-CFT structure and machinery. So that's an important point I want to flag. And secondly, the supervisory authorities, please ensure that with the limited time that is left, that you meet with your relevant officers and you meet with your reporting agencies, and you go through what is required, because we don't want, a lack of preparation on the day in question. I mean, you ought to have done this already. If you have not, please ensure, so that when we go there, we sing from a an orchestra playing the same tune, and we don't have people singing out of scale. So, any assistance that you need, please feel free to contact Mr. Senthill, and we will find the time to sit with you and address whatever concerns you may have. We have strengthened the laws in particular in all the areas that they have flagged in the past. So a major area that they have flagged in the past has been our inability to do forfeiture and seizure of assets that may have been acquired from proceeds of crime. We have corrected that in our legislation in a major way, using perhaps the most modern provisions in the Caribbean. We were assisted in this regard by the World Bank, by the IDB, by the National States Courts of the US, and by the Regional Security Service of the RSS in the Caribbean. So we ought to have the most modern architecture in that regard. The areas of activities that were identified as weaknesses in our structure, we have bridged those gaps. The real estate sector was one of those sectors, because as you know, billions of dollars passed through that sector, and with the advent of the oil and gas economy now, permanently here, spending in real estate, acquisition of assets, etc., have increased significantly. So we have brought that act into force, and we are now in the process of implementing it. And that ought to bring regulation to that important sector. And the other major area that was identified as perhaps weak was the inability in our structure to provide proper supervision over various agencies operating in the financial sector. And we have created in the National Compliance Commission Bill an umbrella body that will now take all these organizations that did not have proper supervisory authority supervising them. This national body will now supervise them in terms of their AML/CFT compliance obligations and duties. And that, in my respectful view and based upon all the information I have received, ought to address all the major gaps that we have had legislatively. Administratively, based upon the technical advice and information I received from Romel Senthill, from Matthew Langevine of the FIU and his team, I believe that we have addressed those administrative protocols. I want to recognize the Commissioner General of the Guyana Revenue Authority. I excuse his late arrival, but he is one of the most important man in this intended exercise, as he is the national collector of revenue, or the main national collector of revenue. And what we are dealing with here largely is revenue and the regulation of revenue and money, and to monitor how they are received, how they are generated, and how they are spent most importantly. So the Memorandum of Understanding, which will be executed in due course, will establish a working framework between the main supervisory agencies and another one in relation to the law enforcement agencies, and will establish that framework that will allow for continuous and constant cooperation and sharing of information. The way that the system works, and if you just apply your minds to it, you will see commonsensically it's an interwoven process to determine whether an activity or a source of income constitutes or can constitute money laundering. You need, for example, the income tax information or the tax information of the performer of that activity. If it is an area, if one of the activities is in precious metals, mining, you need information from the Geology and Mines Commission, you need information from the Gold Board. If it has to do with an unusual transferal of money through the banking system, you need the assistance of Mr. Gobind Ganga and his team. And that is how interwoven the tapestry is in the AML-CFT framework. And that is why this constant cooperation is integral to a successful operation of the system. Hence, the need to execute these memoranda of understanding. Once again, I want to thank you very much for the hard work that you have done, and we expect the work to continue as we undertake this very important national exercise, and I wish you all the best and thank you once again for your attendance here, and expect your hard work to continue. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Attorney General, for that elaboration on Guyana's preparation for the mutual evaluation, where we're headed and how far we've reached thus far. I want to officially recognize the Commissioner General of the Guyana Revenue Authority, Mr. Godfrey Station. And at this time, I would invite Mr. Cint Hill, who will give us some brief remarks on the scoping note. And for those of you who are not aware of the scoping note, the scoping note is this document that the assessment team would have forwarded to Guyana, indicating the areas that they would be assessing, where more weights will be placed. And so Mr. Cint Hill will be giving you some brief remarks on the scoping note at this time.
Thank you, Victor. That presentation will actually be after lunch, but basically, just to give a very brief synopsis, the CFAT have provided a scoping note which looks at the issues which they're going to zero in on. So stemming from the National Risk Assessment, it would have illustrated the weaknesses Guyana had. Give one example. Previously, it would have said, in order to get information from the Commercial Deeds Registry, it would have taken between 7 days and 4 months. So now Guyana has to illustrate to the assessors how far it has come since that NRA was finalized in 2001. But that presentation will, however, be after lunchtime. Right now, we're going to have the MoU signing session, and we're going to commence with the Attorney General and Minister of Legal Affairs, as well as the like to invite the Commissioner of Police to participate in the MoU segment. Mr. David Shamsuddin with the Diana Coulter. We see on 3,000, Diana Coulter. Agent and Michael Gano, Dr. Bowman Gano, also representing the environmental standards. Station of the Ghana Revenue Authority. Just to let everyone know, we have a photo at the very, very end. All right. So I'll invite Ms. Tracy Shamsuli from the Game Authority. I'd like to invite Ms. Cheryl Eva of the Ghana Securities Council. Chief Corporate and Development Officer. Assistant Commissioner of Police, Mr. Karen. like to invite Mr. Neil Dennison, the Commissioner of the Guyana Geology and Mines Commission. Mr. Matthew Landifan, the Director of the Financial Television Unit, invite you to come sign. I'd like to invite Mr. Reza Maharaj from the Commercial Registry. I'd like to invite Mr. Maharaj from the Commercial Registry. And Ms. Sabina Bash. Right, this is the last signature. We have one standing, which is the extension of the Commission Passport Office. Fix that on the edge. to the voters, everyone can come in this direction. Everyone is also invited for lunch, which is served outside of this room, including the press. Please come forward. The heads of agencies.
That's all right.